I'm here with Aaron Diehl. Very excited to talk to you about your upcoming performance at Meany Center, and we're really delighted to host you. And I'm Michelle Witt. I'm the executive and artistic director of Meany Center, and I wanted to just start by asking you if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself as a person, where you grew up, where you live now, and some of your interests outside of music.
My name is Aaron Diehl, and I am a pianist, and I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. My grandfather was a jazz pianist and trombonist, and although my parents were not particularly musical, or they did not play, when I say particularly musical, they didn't necessarily play an instrument. I think maybe my mother played when she was about 6 years old piano, and she didn't have a great teacher, so she quit. And then my dad, I think he played percussion in high school, but other than that, not much musical experience. But they were lovers of music, and they enjoyed listening. And so I was lucky with them having a pretty sizable CD collection of all kinds of music. I played piano in church starting when I was, I guess, about 8 years old. And so that was another way of exposing myself to music. It was a predominantly African-American Catholic church close to where I grew up in Columbus. And so they had a mass at like 9 a.m. that was primarily traditional music, and then there was a mass at 11 a.m. that had gospel music. And so it was really unique.
You're known for your work with the Great American Songbook, and of course have worked with so many different orchestras in a classical context as well. And if you had to pick one or the other, do you feel like you have a greater emphasis in any one of those areas, or is what you're saying specifically sort of against that idea of being
I don't think there's any kind of like purest form of any sort of genre. I mean, I'm thinking about somebody like, well, a good example would be someone like Jelly Roll Morton, who was one of the founders of American, what would be considered American jazz. He's from New Orleans, and he was a Creole man.
Yeah.
And there's a really great recording of him talking to the folklorist Alan Lomax, Library of Congress. He's talking about growing up in New Orleans and all the things he was required to do. So they had to know light opera, arias for light opera. They had to know sort of the folk music of New Orleans. That whole brass band tradition, hymns. They had to know blues, and so all the combination of all of those, all of that repertoire and types of music that someone like Jelly Roll had to learn was then filtered in his own body of work, and you really get the sense of that when you listen to his music. And I think with anybody, I'd say, for the Black American music vernacular, it's really about taking something that's established and then reworking it and sort of outfitting it with a sound that's native to this country, that sort of embodies sort of the complexity of the various cultures that are a part of this country and the combinations of those things. And so I'd say, if I had a time machine, if I could go back to 1721 and listen to J.S. Bach play and spend time with him, I mean, most people would love to do that. Understanding, we have all this work written by him, it's established, but nobody really knows what he sounded like when he improvised. And that was a language that he employed. And I think it's always important. I say this all the time. Music is a language. And all these composers that in the European tradition that we listen to, now it's kind of like, oh, they're on a pedestal. These are like gods and everything. And they were brilliant composers, but they were taking their music was not just created in the vacuum. And there are many different influences and that they had in order to ultimately create the great music that they created. And it was very extemporaneous, especially the music of someone like Bach or Beethoven, who was a great improviser. Same with Mozart. And now we don't really quite think of things like that anymore, unfortunately. And I think that's really important for musicians, especially who are delving into the classical tradition and playing all the repertoires, get beyond the pieces themselves and really dig into the language, how the language was constructed and how it evolved, and what were the influences that these composers had in order to get to their language. And that's one of the things that jazz music really does. We're automatically from day one, we're learning that we have the language of Louis Armstrong, and how how does Louis Armstrong influence someone later like a Dizzy Gillespie, who influenced Freddie Hubbard, and so on and so forth. Now, fortunately, we have recordings of that, right? And we don't have recordings of people playing in the 18th century.
And we don't think of Beethoven as an improviser. We don't think of Mozart as an improviser. And we don't even often think of Bach as an improviser. And of course, there was a lot of improvisation that's really important to Baroque performance tradition.
Music is very much alive if the performers want to make it alive. And I think improvisation is a real key element to that. I always talk about Robert Levin. I'm a big fan of. I've never met him, but he's to hear him improvise on a Mozart cadenza, it really makes the piece sound so fresh and like this is really created for the moment. And I just urge people who have an interest in those languages and those traditions to really look further beyond just the elements of what's in the school, what's written in the score, because at the end of the day, those things are only an indication. They're not really always representative of how they sound, the music sounded and felt during that time.
It seems rare to find musicians who are really equally well versed in classical tradition and jazz tradition and American songbook tradition.
I mean, even as a jazz pianist, that I have to realize that I'm not ever going to be as great as Art Tatum, right? But it still doesn't prevent me from delving into that language and trying to understand like all the great things about someone like a Tatum or a Thelonious Monk. And I think as an improviser, you realize at a certain point that you're going to have many moments that aren't so great, or it's not going to sound great, or it's maybe at best it sounds okay. And I think maybe some of that pressure in the classical music world should be taken off, where everything has to sound like a masterpiece. Because even in the time that those pieces were written, most of them those premieres did not sound good. And there are all kinds of problems. And I was reading this book about Bach, actually, Music in the Castle of Heaven, John Elliott Gardner, really great book.
Oh.
And he was talking about how chaotic it was during the Sunday services in Bach's time, and people coming in late and all kinds of rowdiness going on, and Bach dealing with musicians who didn't show up, who maybe had one too many to drink on a Saturday night, whatever it was. I mean, we look at these performances now, or look at a modern performance, and everything is so polished and everything, and that's not really how it was. And so maybe I'm not saying that one shouldn't strive for a spectacular performance of something, but I'm just saying, like, when the goal is always to create perfection, then I do think something is lost.
Shift a little bit to talking about this particular program. It's American music, music of Black American composers, both sacred and secular music. How did you come to put this program together? What were your, what excites you about this program? It's a fabulous program. I'm super excited about it.
Margaret Bond's, it's a very famous piece that I know has been played a lot these days. It's from 1967, I believe. It's called Troubled Waters, which is based on the spiritual Wade in the Water.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sort of just juxtapose that with Mary Lou Williams' Zodiac Suite, which is a piece that was written in 1944, originally. And then she had a chamber ensemble arrangement in 45. But the Zodiac Suite is sort of Mary Lou Williams' tour de force and one of her most popular pieces. So I wanted to have two Black American women composers as a part of the program integrated in here. And two composers that are really from different traditions in a lot of ways, but obviously because of the folk music element of Black America, there are similarities and overlap and everything. But these are two women that weren't really celebrated as much as they should be. And then William Grant Still, basically contemporaries, William Grant Still and Duke Ellington. So William Grant Still, Seven Traceries, and Duke Ellington's New World to Come In. And the same concept is, these are two African American men who came from different traditions, but obviously there's overlap with that. And the Ellington New World to Come In is a piano concerto that he wrote for his band, for himself. And the title is based off a book by a guy named Roy Otley, and it's basically about the dream of better working and living conditions for African Americans post World War II. Mm-hmm. So that's New World to Come In. The Seven Traceries is really seven sort of like mystic pieces, if you will, written in sort of the octatonal style, and so it's I think I'm supposed to be starting with the set of pieces, but Still was called the Dean of Afro-American Composers. And so you have Afro-American Symphony, and I mean there's a number of works. Another great set of pieces is Three Visions. Mm-hmm. So anyhow, that's basically what's on the program for this concert.